Hello and welcome to Homebrew Hacking in History. I wanted to call this talk DIY Radical Video Game Histories and Counter Histories for everyone, but that was apparently really long for the schedule. So consider that my subtitle. Thank you so much for turning out. I really appreciate it. It's my first MAGFest. Everyone's been super nice and welcoming, so I super appreciate it. So let's just jump in. So my name is Rachel Simone Weil. I have been wanting to come to MAGFest for years. Finally got it together, so thanks to the team for bringing me here. Some of you may actually know me by my alias Partytime Excellent. I came from the chiptune VJ world, kind of doing NES-based glitch visual art at shows like 8 Static and Lit Festival. I also help run an indie games festival in Austin, Texas called Fantastic Arcade. And I'm also the founder of a video game archive and history project called FEMICOM Museum, which is dedicated to preserving the history of femme and girly and cute video game software and electronic toys from the 20th century. So that's a little bit about me and my background. As you might have been able to guess from my bio and the title of my talk, I've spent the last 10 to 15 years, maybe, doing homebrew for various 8-bit systems. So do we have any homebrew developers in the house? That's a raise of hands. Maybe go like, woo! Oh, you guys. That was pretty good. So yeah, I've been doing homebrew, I guess, ROM hacking since maybe the late 90s, and then homebrew since around 2007. So I've been doing the, composing the music, doing the art, the assembly language coding, cartridge soldering, all of that kind of stuff. This is a title screen from a game that I'm working on for Belly Astrocode. I actually got into homebrew via ROM hacking. And this was actually my first NES ROM hack, done back in the year 2002. As you can tell, it is a ROM hack of Super Mario Brothers with Hello Kitty. I put this screenshot on Tumblr years ago, and someone downloaded it to use for the cover of their lo-fi chill wave album on SoundCloud. Which I was like, fair. So in addition to software hacking, of course, I love electronics and tinkering with toys and reverse engineering stuff. This is another project I did for the NES with Andy. Hi. Adding Wi-Fi to the NES. So this was released back in 2016, and I made an NES cartridge that displays live Twitter feed, so you can literally tweet at your NES. This just plugs into the controller port, and that gives it access to the internet. And of course, there's a hand-stitched Wi-Fi cozy, because every piece of networking hardware needs a cozy, IMO. So that's a little bit about some of my previous work. We've done some other games and ROMs, things like that. And on top of that, obviously, I'm super passionate and invested in video game history, not only through the FEMICOM Museum project, where I'm kind of preserving the history of girls' games, but also through various video game history exhibits I've curated. And I actually taught video game history at the University of Texas for 2 years. So yeah, homebrew hacking and history are kind of my jam. I'm really, really stoked to share them with you all today, and maybe share some of my hot takes about kind of where the homebrew and hacking scenes have been, so a little bit of the history, and importantly, where you can personally take them next. I think I used to not like history until I understood oh, it's actually relevant to people today. It's not about memorizing dates. And I kind of came to love history through video game history. Now, hacking and homebrew is a niche hobby. It's weird. It's not for everyone, but it is for everyone who wants to be here. And I'm especially talking to the people who think to themselves oh, it's too hard, I don't get it, assembly's weird, I can't code, electronics are for wizards. And no one would even like the stuff that I make. I have weird ideas. None of those things is true, right? I mean, maybe you can't code or you can't solder right now, but you can learn. I believe in you, because I too once thought all of those things, and I'm completely self-taught. So you can do it, and we're gonna talk about how in a little bit. So before we get started, I kind of want to make sure we're all on the same page about what hacks and homebrews are and how they're similar or different from mods and bootlegs and the licensed games. These are all words that are kind of similar, and we talk about them together, but there's a little bit of distinction. So we're gonna just do some quick definitions, make sure we're all on the same page about what all these things mean. So a mod is a consumer-created modification to an existing game, hence mod, and so is a hack. So in some ways they're quite similar, but colloquially, and the way that we tend to use them in the community is a little bit different. So modding tends to be associated with PC games, tends to be newer games, but one of the important distinguishing factors is that usually modding software is with the tools that are provided by the person or the team that made the game. And so it's a little bit more sanctioned. That's typically how we talk about modding. So something like The Sims, like games where you get tools to actually mod a game. PC games, contemporary PC games, the assets may be a little bit easier to get at. So one game I modded recently was Doki Doki Literature Club. Has anyone played that? Yeah. This is a great game to mod, and I don't even want to say why because spoilers, but y'all should definitely crack that game open. But I was actually really surprised at how easy it was to mod, because again, I'm coming from like the NES ROM hacking world. You could just look at the files, like, oh, this is Python. I can just read the code. It's really great and convenient. And that's something you don't really get the luxury of with older games for NES, Atari, things like that. So hacking is mostly associated with older games, console games, often cartridge, older cartridge-based systems. But I've done some GameCube hacking, and I would consider that hacking rather than modding, even though it's not a cartridge. But typically, it's a little bit less sanctioned. You're typically modifying games that the creators did not actually want you to modify, and they may have actually gone to great lengths to make sure that you could not modify them. So that's typically how we talk about hacking. And often with these older games, we don't have the source code. We don't have a folder of sprite assets. We can't just open up Super Mario Brothers and find the one-up mushroom. That's not exactly how it works. You just have the binary, and you have to scroll through it with a hex editor and look at stuff that looks like this. Yeah. Thank you for the woo. Now, you might have better tools for ROM hacking. Hopefully this isn't your only tool, but sometimes it is. And obviously it requires specialized knowledge to be able to look at this and make sense of it, right? You would need really platform-specific knowledge to be able to modify a game just by overwriting values in this file. But you may also be able to use community-created tools that can extract graphics, for example. So you may have some additional tools. This might look scary, but it's actually really rad to learn, because once you learn how to ROM hack and you start understanding things like base 16 and where things are stored in memory and what hex codes equal what, one, you're on the path to starting to learn assembly language, which you could use for Homebrew, and you just become mega powerful and feel like you can look through the matrix, and you start being able to debug other things. So I think it has some actual really cool side effects. So an example of a really basic ROM hack I did back in 2013 was I took the typeface from this game. This is Barbie, which was released for the NES in 1991. And woo, high-tech expressions. I took this sort of script font and I put it into Mega Man. And that's all I did. That's the extent of the hack. It's called it's Mega Man 2 Barbie Dreams type hack. Someone tweeted about this when it came out, and they said it was the stupidest hack they'd ever seen. And people are entitled to their own opinions, and not everyone's gonna love your art, but look at those numbers don't lie. Over the course of more than 5 years, it was downloaded 500 times by people or probably download bots, so sick. Now who had the last laugh? So we talked a little bit about hacks and mods and what the differences are there. Again, some people will use those interchangeably. I've given you the definitions that I come across most in the community and sort of the distinctions there. And now let's talk a little bit about Homebrew. So Homebrew refers to basically consumer-made games for systems that were not intended to be user programmable. So let's think about that for a minute. Back in the day, early computers wanted you to program them. They yearned for it. They yearned to be programmed. They actually came with manuals telling you how to write code. And there was a simple, like Commodore, not that simple, but you could save your programs that you wrote to media, so they didn't flit out of existence when you powered down the machine. Now, that gets a little bit harder when we start moving into the era of home consoles in the US. Like, how do you make a game for this, the Atari 2600, right? It's a cartridge system, so how do you make a cartridge? How do you make the plastic? How do you burn the ROMs? Like, you don't, right? That's not something that the average consumer can do. And I'm gonna, well, actually myself here and say, well, actually, there was a version of BASIC for the Atari 2600. It had a big flaw. Well, it had two big flaws. One is that you couldn't save your programs. There's no like internal storage, it didn't have like a hard drive. And so if you turned off the computer, your program was gone. And the other flaw, or downside I guess, was that you entered the code with games.
Oh my God.
So imagine writing a game with this, and then when you turn the Atari off, or your power goes out, it's gone. So yeah, this is, these are basically two Atari controllers, keypads, and you kind of cycle through, like if you remember the old flip phones, where you would do like, if you wanted C, you pressed A 3 times. There's kind of a similar thing going on with a lot of these Atari controllers that use like paddles or keypads to do Atari, BASIC. And then when we move to things like the NES and the Genesis, like, again, these consoles did not have persistent on-system storage. They had really limited onboard RAM as well, because they had to have awesome graphics, right, and still be affordable. And in the 80s, you typically just got to pick one. And then of course, at NES and Nintendo, they were particular about things. They didn't want just anyone making games for the NES because they wanted to keep tight reins on quality, and they wanted to prevent piracy and all these things. So they actually pretty actively prevented you from making games. And so if you decide to make a game for the NES, you are engaging in homebrew, right? It's again, a consumer-made game for systems not intended to be user programmable. This is mostly for game consoles, but it could be other things too. Like, I guess, you know, your microwave is not meant to be user programmable, so if you wrote Snake for the display, that would probably be homebrew as well. If someone does that, please let me know. And then I wanted to touch briefly on the word bootleg. So some people use bootleg and unlicensed games interchangeably. I personally don't. The way I think of it, I think a lot of the community thinks about it, is that bootleg games refer to games with unlicensed content versus like an unlicensed game which is an original game but was not licensed by the console maker. So it was kind of a confusing distinction there, but if you think just about bootleg as like a game that has basically unlicensed content, that's pretty easy to remember. So just as an example, if I made a game about Pokemon characters, which I did, then that would be a bootleg. And Nintendo could send me a cease and desist letter, which they did. So, also, just want to point out, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but those are not Pokemon, those are the sprites from Binary Land. But you know, whatever. There are 3 basic categories of bootleg games. So you've got unauthorized reproductions, right? So if I start making my own copies of Super Mario Brothers cartridges and sell them on the internet, that would be an unauthorized reproduction. Some games are hacks. So they'll take a game and maybe change the name of it and change a couple sprites so it seems different, but it's actually, you know, pretty obviously a bootleg game. And then there's this third category, which is original games. So you can have a completely original game, but again, it's based on IP that the creator does not have a license to. This is a bootleg game that I saw at a Goodwill last week. That's called Making Love. So this is a ROM hack of a game called Battle City. And if you notice, there's a tank as the selection for. I love the selection options. It says 1 lover, 2 lovers, and I love you. It's really good. So this is a ROM hack of Battle City. I think that as far as the name goes, Making Love, I don't think it's a content choice. I think it's that making has the same number of letters as battle, and love has the same number of letters as city. And when you're ROM hacking, it's actually quite difficult to add tiles in new places, or I think this was for ease of hacking. So I just made me crack up when I saw it at Goodwill. One thing I wanted to add about bootleg before we sort of move on is that I think there's a little bit of a, maybe you could say, like cultural judgment sort of baked into this word. So if we think, if we could imagine, for example, Harry Potter RPG for Game Boy, what a world. If it's made in the US, then I might refer to it as like a fan game or homebrew or a love letter. Whereas if it comes from China or Russia, I might call it bootleg or pirate. And so there's a little bit of a bias there, there's a little bit of a judgment. And so I think that's something like, it's sort of an unfair bias that I think we would all do well to eliminate. So the next time you see a bootleg game, just think of it as like homebrew or fan games. I mean, it's pretty much the same kind of stuff. And you can see all of these categories really blend into each other. So we're all good on the terms? Yeah, okay, good. I see some nodding heads, great. So I want to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a homebrew scene. So it would be awesome if we could talk about the history of all of homebrew ever, but it's so immense that it would take hours, and I really want to go to the demo scene workshop later, so we're going to keep it brief. And so I kind of wanted to give an overview of what a homebrew scene looks like, and that way we can sort of apply this anatomy of a scene to different scenes, whether it's NES or GBA or Genesis or something like that. And we'll actually walk through 3 homebrew scenes quickly as sort of illustrative examples. And of course, when I say homebrew scene, I don't mean like a clique or like, you know, a group of people with scene hair. I'm just talking about like a loose community that forms around a specific platform or console. I kind of thought about this actually as like the life cycle of a star. You know, there's like the red giant, the dwarf, and these sort of different possibilities based on whether the star is really big. And it's kind of like homebrew scenes. Some are bigger than others. Some burn bright and then just become a black hole. Some kind of implode in on themselves. And it's pretty true of a lot of scenes, but it made me think of this. So if we could think about the anatomy of a homebrew scene, this is kind of the basic path. And first thing that typically emerges in a homebrew scene are game dumps and emulators. And this is sort of like the proto scene. It's really hard to write homebrew without a way to test it in software. You don't want to solder something every time you want to test out your new sprite. And it's not just about testing homebrew, but it's actually about knowing how the heck to write the software, because these older systems are very hardware specific. If you're writing an assembly language, for example, you need to know the hardware pretty intimately, and you don't necessarily have time to reverse engineer it. So someone writes an emulator, that's awesome. They document it. They document how they wrote the emulator and what they learned in the development process, and we get the beginning of docs. So hardware documentation, software docs. Emulation is usually the prereq here, because this is what helps people sort of figure out how the system ticks. How does it work? Where's the, you know, how do I get a RAM? Is there a screen buffer? How many colors can be on screen at once? These are things that usually emerge soon after the development of an emulator. Tools come next, if you're lucky. Things like compilers, disassemblers, graphic editors. This is a popular one, YYCHR. It's a multi-platform graphics editor for, I think it does a Game Boy, and NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, quite a few. And so this makes homebrew development much faster and more accessible, because I can actually see the letters instead of trying to look at the hex codes and figure out what pixels they represent and things like that. Other tools that you might have at your disposal would be level editors for ROM hacking, music creation tools like FEMICOM or Deflamask. We were talking about this, is it Deflamask? Deflamask? That's weird when you like have a hobby that you never talk to other humans about, and then you're like, how do I say these words out loud? I've never had to do it before. Anyway, so tools like that. And at first, these docs and tools we kind of scattered across the web on people's personal websites or GitHub or whatever. But eventually there's one motivated person or a team who's like, hey, we should put a site together where we collect all this stuff so people can actually find it. A clever idea. And there are often forums that come along with that as well, where people can sort of share tips or ask questions or things like that. And finally, if your team is really lucky, really lucky, you get tutorials, how-to guides, beginner guides, that's a rare one, source code that you can actually look through and model your own code after. And this is a sign that a community is fairly mature, because they're actually welcoming outsiders. A lot of scenes, it's not just homebrew, a lot of any sort of niche scene, some people might want it to stay small, they want to keep the knowledge for themselves, or they may even actively discourage other people from joining. Just as an example, I was lurking on a demo scene forum. I won't say which one, but it starts with the letter P. And I was curious to know if there are other women in demo scene. And so I did a forum search and I found a thread, and sure enough, someone was asking the same questions. And the comments were, I know this is really small, but I'll read them out loud. Keeping women out is, among other things, a sanity measure. Today's women have a tendency to ruin things and make everything unpleasant. Until some actually suitable female candidates appear on our doorstep and beg that we let them in, I say let's keep them bitches out and continue enjoying ourselves. This is just one comment. Some other people continued on. What's the point? I'm not going to read all the expletives here. What's the point of a complete list of female demo sceners when maybe 5 to 6 are actually worth mentioning? And someone replies, it's a hit list. So, and nobody said, hey, that's not cool. No mods pulled the posts. And this was the day that I lost interest in joining that community, and I never went back to that forum. I don't know how to apply that, because it kind of sucks, right? They're probably not the only one who left. It sucks when people say, like, we're not going to let some people in. But, ha, I'm still here. You can clap for that. How about that? And of course, there are a lot of awesome people in the scene, so I believe and hope that this is an exception rather than a rule, but it does exist. And so the really mature scenes hopefully actually welcome beginners, welcome outsiders, and welcome people regardless of what kind of group they're in. Now, the thing about scene health is really important because a homebrew scene can die or go dormant pretty much like a star at any of these points if people aren't active. So an emulator may get created, but maybe it was made for Windows Vista, and now it doesn't work on any contemporary platform, and that emulator may as well have never existed. Or you find docs and text files on geocities.co.jp. That's gone. So activity is really important. Maintaining these docs is important. Updating them. Don't have tutorials that are like, well, if you're on a Pentium 2 machine, you know, like things that go outdated can actually contribute to sort of scene death. So that's a thing as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the NES as an example because it's the scene I'm probably most familiar with. And I really started, again, I started ROM hacking in 2002 or so, but I really started doing homebrew right around 2007. So this is kind of an incredibly vague timeline, which I'll explain here in a second. The emulators and docs phase really reached its peak around 1997 with the release of the emulator Nastical. I don't know if anyone here remembers this. Yeah. I had this on my Windows 95 machine when I was a kid, and I was on a family computer, so I had to change the icon. I changed it to that MS-DOS icon, interlocked one, yeah. So this is actually probably one of the most important pieces of software, like not only for homebrew and hacking, but for all of retro gaming actually, and like preservation, retro gaming culture. This is a really pivotal piece. This was not the first NES emulator, but it was the first popular one. It was really well featured. It had movie recording and save states, and even a way to view pattern tables and tiles, and actually had hack games in the emulator. And that's how I did a lot of the first part of the Hello Kitty ROM hack. I didn't know how to code. I was like a stupid teenager, but I was able to use Nastical to hack. Start out hacking the graphics of the game, and eventually started learning hacks and things like that to change the levels. I mean, I can't really like overstate how important this piece of software is. Just to look at it from one perspective, if you think about it, this is the first time you could see pixels in 8-bit games, right? Those crisp squares, a sort of iconic representation of retro gaming aesthetic. That's not what those games actually looked like, right? CRTs have these offset phosphors, and the graphics are blurry. This is why we think of I mean, this basically is what created pixel art, right? Being able to take a home computer and take Mario and blow him up like 3,000 times. And you can see all those really great pixels on these high resolution displays. I kind of think of this emulation as the origin of pixel art, not the actual games themselves. And of course, these tools were essential for people learning to hack. Throughout 97, 98, 99, there were a lot of technical docs written. YYCHR came out in 99. There was a website called So Far's Domain that was started up actually maybe earlier, around 97 or maybe a bit earlier. By the early 2000s, there's quite a bit of documentation out there, and you could, by the year 2000, you could learn how to write a game for the NES. Some of the documentation was wrong, but a lot of that foundation was there. You had NestDev, the Proteus forums, Jeremy Chadwick's work, people were putting docs out. I printed hard copies of them because at the time they were incomprehensible, and I thought, I'll just highlight words and circle words I don't know and things like that. It was a pretty big reference point for me personally. So I had this like ... 2007, and it's not that nothing happened between 99 and 2007, but I would say that the scene kind of stabilized. So we had like a good amount of docs, there was an active forum, and things were pretty stable. And in 2007, two really important things happened. First, someone by the alias Bunny Boy released a relatively affordable NES cartridge with a compact flash reader, meaning that regular people could test homebrew ROMs on hardware, and this was a really big deal. Does anyone remember when this came out? It was a really big deal, right? Yeah, it was huge. And the other thing that happened in 2007 is also Bunny Boy released a series of tutorials called Nerdy Nights on Nintendo Age, and I use these. Many people in the NES homebrew scene learned from these, and they were really well written and thorough. They are still up there if you want to check them out. And I think that really caused a big renaissance in the homebrew scene, and you start to see a lot more people working on their own games after that moment. So now you've got NES games on Kickstarter. You have NES games that you can buy here at MAGFest, which is awesome. Like quite a few new titles. There's the NES Dev documentary. Lots of homebrew here at MAGFest. So lots of small labels and companies and people like Kevin Hanley, who helped me immensely when I was first learning and hanging out on Nintendo Age many years ago. So it's very cool. So that's NES. We're going to compare that to another homebrew scene, Valley Astrocade. NES is the only homebrew scene in the world. This was a really interesting one. There's really rich documentation, really rich tutorials, but pretty much just one website, which is valleyalley.com, and almost no dev tools, which I found out the hard way when I tried to start writing my own homebrew and was like, okay, cool, where's the graphics editor? Oh no, there's not one? Okay, great. Music editor? No, doesn't exist. Okay, so I've got to write this in assembly and design all my graphics in assembly and write all my music in assembly. This is going to be tricky. I ended up writing my own graphics conversion tool in Python so I could import, bitmaps and stuff. And I also made this paint program that runs the browser and actually exports Z80 assembly language, so I could just include, I could draw it instead of trying to imagine in my mind and divine out the hex code. So why are there such great docs but such few tools? It was a really interesting experience when I first got into that scene. And the reason is that there aren't that many people in the scene. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Valley Astrocade is not a well-known console. It's a console that has a lot of hardware failures, so the ones out there often are flaky, the controllers don't work. I think the NES really benefited from that flash cart. The Astrocade flash carts have appeared over time and sort of disappeared. I made 10 and then I never made any more again. And it's really all the documentation and rich history is really because of Adam, who runs Valley Alley, just incredibly dedicated, documenting every single thing about this console. And he's been keeping this website running for 20 years. And I have downloaded the entire website as a zip file, because if that website ever goes down, we will lose all of Valley Astrocade history. I feel like it's just a sort of one-stop shop. So I encourage other people to check out Astrocade Dev. It's really wild, it's fun, and there's still a lot to create, and there aren't that many people in the scene, which I'm not saying like, ooh, you get to be part of a cool exclusive club, but there aren't any rules yet, there aren't any standards yet, and there still aren't a lot of tools yet, so there's a lot of opportunity to innovate. And lest you think that all the game platforms have been emulated and have rich homebrew scenes, nay. The loopy 32-bit console by Casio in 1995 has no working emulator, much less any of these other things. As some of you may have heard, I was talking about this earlier. I was chatting with a guy at the bar during a tech conference last year about how frustrating it was. I couldn't play Hari Hari Seal Paradise. I couldn't play Little Romance because there's no emulator for the Casio Loopy. I mean, I've got the hardware, but you know, I want to get this homebrew thing rolling. And you know, just at the bar drinking, just complaining to someone about video games, as I usually do when I'm at the bar. And he called my bluff, and he actually started writing the emulator. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And he's actually streaming his emulator development process on Twitch. So thanks, Ben Smith. It's really awesome. You should check that out. Yeah. But this is pretty exciting, actually, because this could be the beginning of a loopy homebrew scene that right now does not exist. In our lifetimes, we could see a new homebrew scene emerge. And I know y'all want to get that sweet Casio like FM sound chip. It sounds so good. We need a tracker for it so badly. Cool. All right. So I feel that I am about at time, but I'm gonna wrap up here with some of the challenges. Learning curve, constraints, and audience reach. These are the things that homebrewers know are challenges. This is what makes it fun. And I think there's one other piece that's missing from this, and that is having something to say, right? Why homebrew? Why are you revisiting this old system? How are you pushing its limits, and why? I don't know, I like the NES aesthetic, I like the way it sounds. I started collecting for NES in high school, but even though I have nostalgia for it, I want my NES games to say something more than, I liked Nintendo games when I was a child, so I made a Nintendo game, and now I'm a child. Like, to me, that is not an interesting, you know, it's not as interesting as it could be. And I think that unexamined nostalgia is actually bad. Svetlana Boym put this really well. She said, nostalgia is a promise to rebuild the ideal home that lies at the core of many powerful ideologies of today, tempting us to relinquish critical thinking for emotional bonding. The danger of nostalgia is that it tends to confuse the actual home with an imaginary one. In extreme cases, it can create a phantom homeland for the sake of which one is ready to die or kill. And I think you can probably all think of times in gaming culture, or in American culture at large, when people are ready to die or kill over an imaginary past that doesn't even exist. And so we can't do that with NES games. I also don't think it can be just about creativity within constraints. A lot of people talk about that with 8-bit art, that it's like, being creative within constraints. It's cool, and I get that. But I think that, like, at the end of the day, it's a Game Boy, or it's an NES, and trying to strip the historical context from that object is like bad. It's bad, don't do that. We don't strip away the context from symbols and objects and ask people to not worry about what they used to mean, right? And I wrote about this for the Journal of Pure Production, kind of about hacking and chip music and stuff like that. And I kind of said it eloquently, so I thought I would just put it up here so I didn't stumble through my definition that I wrote previously. When the distinctive looks of 8-bit console graphics are stripped of their relationships to 1980s and 1990s video game history in the name of what Elizabeth Guffey calls trendy detachment, we risk incorporating unexamined values while losing opportunities to craft meaning from triumphs and failures of the past. So if we just say like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's Game Boy, but it's like, it's not the nostalgia thing, I just think it's really cool how constrained it is. Well, we're actually stripping all the context away from that historical object, which doesn't work. We can't do that. We can't divorce the object from what it is and what it represents. We don't do that with other symbols and flags and words and things in our culture, and we shouldn't try to do that with video game consoles. And furthermore, we're actually discarding a really great opportunity to make cultural commentary, right? Like, And it's difficult, like, get it. I'm not trying to throw shade on homebrew developers or chipmusic, like, I get it, I'm on your side. But this is kind of where I would encourage you guys to actually step in, right? And not just say like, oh, I don't know, it's about nostalgia, or oh, it's not about nostalgia. To me, like, both of those are sort of unexamined views, and so I'm gonna say, hey, what if we pushed on that a little bit more? Maybe we could like expand the boundaries of that a little bit more. And now we get back to why this talk was subtitled DIY Radical Video Game Histories and Counter Histories for Everyone. So homebrew and hacking don't have to be about making yet another Metroidvania. Or yet another Mario. Or yet another Mega Man. Homebrew and hacking are actually your opportunities to rewrite history. You actually get a do-over. This is pretty cool, right, when you think about it. With homebrew, we can make any sort of game and like pretend that it actually came out on this old system. The original hardware sort of gives truth to these counter histories. We could do anything. Why would we keep making the same childhood that screwed us up and got us here? I mean, are you sad that we never had like an awesome Latina crime-fighting duo for the Sega Game Gear, or that we didn't have like a meditative app for the Virtual Boy, or a tax preparation game for this, I don't know, GBA? Like, you can do that. I don't know about that feature, but like you can. Or like an RPG where everyone is like hella queer and they're all trying to date each other. Like you could do that. You could go make it happen, right? And if you think that your ideas don't fit in the canon of retro gaming, guess what? You're exactly the kind of people that need to be making homebrew, because you have something really different to say, and you can provide this sort of counter history or alternative history that we need. You're going to make different kinds of docs and tutorials and source code. I don't want to make shooters, so I don't know if I need another tutorial about how to write a side-scrolling shooter, right? Like, it'd be really interesting to bring these different perspectives in. And the power of homebrew, to me, lies in the ability to rewrite history, right? Like, not just in your mind, but to actually rewrite history and then let someone else experience it. Put it on a cartridge and hand it to them and say, yeah, put that bad boy in the Sega Genesis and tell me what you think. That's a really cool opportunity. And I think as homebrewers, if we don't take advantage of that, we're sort of missing out. When I was little, I thought the NES was for boys. And today, I use NES Homebrew to ask, hey, what if there had been more 8-bit games that would have appealed to me when I was 5 or 6 years old? Like, you know, fortune tellers, or cute games about romance or crafting or ponies. A lot of people laughed when I made a horoscope game for the NES, and some people didn't, because they sort of got at what I was pointing at, and it was super rewarding to me. There's sort of more than one way to remember your childhood and incorporate nostalgia that isn't about recreating the existing library of the NES. And I just, you know, you can tell a lot of my work is very influenced by like gender and girly stuff and the things that I'm nostalgic for, you know, just growing up personally. But you could take this in any direction, right? The idea isn't about gender per se, it's about this idea of rewriting history and taking your unique perspective and applying that to homebrew. It's super powerful. So if you're interested in actually going and doing some homebrew or hacking yourself, I really hope you are. I knew that I couldn't really do like a workshop in this setting. It would be fun, but again, I gotta go to that demo city thing in a minute. But do definitely come find me, ask me, talk to me on Twitter. I'll put up my handle in a second. But I hope you come away, even if you didn't necessarily learn how to hack a game or write your own homebrew in this talk, I hope you came away inspired to actually go learn more about it. It's super fun. It's what got me interested in writing code. And I'm a software developer now, and it's because of stuff like this that I thought was really fun. So I really encourage you to check it out. I'm going to put some resources up here. If you want to take a picture of this with your phone, this would be a great time to do that. Yeah, get out your phones. These are some 8-bit game dev resources. These are the ones I'm most familiar with, and so I can kind of personally vouch for. Nintendo Age, Atari Age, Valley Alley for Astrophy Dev, SMS Power for Sega Master System, and NES Dev as well. All full of docs, tutorials, source code, things like that. Great places to get started. And again, also come find me. This is how you can find me on the internet. My GitHub actually has a bunch of NES and AbstractKit stuff that I've open sourced as well. So if you want to look through commented code, this would totally be a good place to find that. I'm actually going to open up to questions in a minute, but I'm going to end here. I'm going to end with one last plug, which is come back here at midnight. We're doing the Weird History panel. I'm going to be talking about the weird true history of Barbie fashion designer, which is going to be really cool. There are a bunch of other panelists that are going to be talking about other weird cool games, so if it's midnight and you got nothing to do, come by. But other than that, that's all I've got, so thanks very much, and I'll take some questions. Yes, go.
Has Nintendo ever acknowledged or understand this progress?
Cool, so the question was, has Nintendo ever acknowledged the homebrew scene aside from takedown requests? This is a fraught question. Yes. In fact, you should find Frank Cifaldi and talk to him about that. Yeah, look, there he is. There's been a lot of interesting research about the possibility that someone who works at Nintendo actually worked on one of the first NES emulators, which that person may have then been brought in-house to Nintendo to work on in-house emulators for Pokemon and Animal Crossing and things like that. So there's some interesting history there. In terms of I haven't heard of Nintendo ever shutting down homebrew developers. The hardware patents have expired, and as long as you're not using their IP, I don't think I've heard of any case of Nintendo going to emulators. Another question, yeah?
Did you ever finish Taxi?
In a sense. No. Yeah, this is a great question. Did I ever finish Taxi? One thing about writing homebrew is that you don't finish a lot of things. A lot of it actually is you want to prove out a concept or say oh, could I make this thing? I have this really cool idea for a mechanic, and then you do it and you're yeah. And then the challenge is done. And then you're oh, I just gotta design 5,000 levels, and then it never gets finished. So thank you for calling me out on stage. I know it's not done, you will be the first to know when it is. What he's talking about actually is a screenshot. Faxi's Unicorn Blast, which is a side-scrolling shooter where you play as a unicorn and you shoot little beads out of your horn. But the sort of gimmick of it is that instead of it being a real unicorn flying through space, it's a girl holding a string and she's dragging it. It's a toy. So it's kind of in her imagination of the unicorn shooting things. And you can see tape. She's made a little backdrop, and there's little scotch tape. And if you ever played Micro Machines for NES, there's those everyday objects around the house. So it's a kind of a similar idea. Yeah, it's not done. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you ever worked with Wonder Swan stuff?
I've never worked with Wonder Swan stuff.
Oh, dang.
No, but there's a pretty good scene because there's a dev kit for the Wonder Swan.
Yeah, the Wonder Witch.
Yeah. I saw Wonder Witch when I was in Tokyo, and I really wanted to buy it, and I thought it might be cheaper in Japan.
$1,000.
No, it's not. Super expensive, and I was a grad student, and I did not buy it. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just thinking when you mentioned chipmusic music, just making music, for homebrew settings. You mentioned SMS Power, and I immediately thought of BGM Play, that community that's working at bgmrips.net, making. I don't know if it's exactly emulation or tools when they work on emulating or recreating the soundtracks to various arcade games, ripping those and making them translatable into BGM plays as something that you play back through the tool, or something you can code to MP3 or something. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, I don't know that much about that scene actually. I don't know if I presented myself as someone who's a member of all scenes all the time, but that's pretty hard to do. So no, I haven't checked it out. It's like ripping soundtracks out of arcade games and stuff.
It's ripping, it's doing it on code, it's basically right from the code. So it's the most direct rips you can possibly get. This isn't doing it through, normally we would do this through an emulation function, but in this case there are many games, like arcade games, on special PCBs or distinct hardware that you have to kind of just do the hard way. And the VGM play is a universal means of playing that back.
Yeah. I think in some ways it's sort of the inverse of the homebrew scene, right? Like they're getting the content out and we want to put the content in.
Yeah.
But yeah, probably rolling with a lot of the same food. Yeah. Yeah, question.
When you got into homebrew, was there a game that you wanted to make, like something that you had in your mind that you just wanted to do? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. Was there a game I wanted to make? Is that why I got into NES? It's interesting. So I didn't have an NES growing up. And I ended up collecting for the NES in high school, way after the NES was like, it was that moment where it was old, but it wasn't collectible. So I was going to garage sales and picking up like 50-cent or like 25-cent games. And so I had a little bit of a different perspective on like NES and nostalgia. And I wasn't really nostalgic for games other than I had seen other kids playing NES. I thought it would be cool to make music videos with the NES. And I don't know where I got that idea from, but I think the closest thing I can think of is that when I was a kid, we had a Macintosh SE30 that my mom pulled out of the trash at her job. And that was also quite old when we got it. And it had After Dark. And I loved After Dark. I mean, I could have not had anything else on that computer but After Dark. I don't know if I used it for anything else other than looking at After Dark screensavers. And I think that was really what inspired me. Like when it came to NES, it's like, oh, like After Dark was sort of pixelated, and again, I was sort of like, because I didn't have that nostalgia, I was sort of like pulling together all these disparate things that I remembered from my childhood and trying to find similarities between them. And so I think in my mind I was just like, oh, retro games, it's like After Dark, which I'm not sure is like a exactly straight path, but I think that's kind of what got me interested. And actually my first NES like production outside of just doing sort of testing and stuff was a music video. I just like met this guy randomly at a show and I was like, yeah, I've been doing like NES stuff. I was like, I don't know if I was trying to be cool or something, but I was like, yeah, I could make a music video for your song. And he was like, okay, do it. And so I did, and I don't know, I think we put it on YouTube or something. It's probably not there anymore, but yeah, that was my first prod. Yes, question back.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on like expanding the capabilities of the original hardware? Like, do you think, I don't know, that the NES loses its soul at some point if people are putting a lot of capabilities into new cartridge types that weren't there in the old days?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Frank was asking, like, what do you think about people expanding the NES's capabilities? Or there was that, like, I don't know if you're referring to like this. Oh, the Raspberry Pi. I was thinking of the, well, I don't know if this is what you're talking about, the Super NES on the NES. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think it's cool what he did. First of all, like, so definitely no shade on him. It was a really neat demo. But yeah, at some point, like, in that case, I feel like the NES is sort of a pass-through more than the development console. So it's fun and it's cool, but to me, it's maybe not NES Homebrew, or like, I'm not quite sure what it is. And again, like, when I judge a game, not like sitting on my throne, like, but when I'm sort of like judging a game, what I think about is that question about like, why did you do this? What do you have some cultural point that you're trying to make, or some critique, or something like that? And I actually think that in that case, running the SNES stuff on the NES, it showed a really interesting technical thing. It was like, hey, you know, the NES was really limited, but here's how you could expand it. And it sort of, to me, the alternate history was, what if the NES had been expanded, right? Because there was that expansion port, and what might we have done with the NES expansion port? So I think there's an interesting counter history narrative there, and I like the project for that reason, and I just think it's cool. But yeah, also I feel like the NES is a pass-through, and that's okay. It's not. I'm not like hating on it for that, but yeah, that's my take on that. Yes.
You had mentioned earlier that you thought it was counterproductive to make homebrew purely for the aesthetic or without examining the nostalgia behind it. And you had said something interesting about how you have to, you should be looking at homebrew in the context of the system itself that you're developing for. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because I know what that sort of meant to me, but it wasn't clear what that meant to you.
Yeah, so kind of expanding on that thing of like, you can't take a Game Boy and strip all the context away. Like, so for me, like, if you're using, we'll just use a Game Boy for an example, because it's quite common hardware to use in chipmusic. You know, it's a consumer product. It wasn't user hackable. Like, it's a, you know, I think there are people that like have really interesting critiques of consumer culture and capitalism, but then they're like, yeah, the Game Boy rules, and it's like, well, you're in, you know, like think about the other values that you're incorporating when you're using this system that has like designed obsolescence, and there are other things going on. I know like we can't all be perfect on all of our values all the time, and everything's a balance, and I get that. But to me, it seems harmful to strip the context away from an object. And really what I mean there is like, you know, a Confederate flag is not just a flag that is, you can strip all the context of, right? It has context with it. And if you try to strip all the context from it, things can go awry. And so I think that's kind of what and Game Boy, I think, is a more innocuous example. But still, it's like we're taking these objects and sort of not examining them and not thinking about how they fit in with our own values. And I think for me, where that sort of intersects with my interest in like gender stuff, for example, is like, oh, it's like a Game Boy, like it's this common thing that we all have the same experience of. Or the NES is this common thing we all have this experience of. And for me, my experience of NES as a kid was watching boys play and not having one and not feeling like it was for me. And so I think when we come into something and decide we're just going to strip the context away, it doesn't work like that. And we're all coming at things with different perspectives and things like that. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Yeah.
You talked about electronics just a little bit at the beginning. Have you looked into online communities? Have you ever found one that was more than just college kids trying to get other people to do their homework for them?
Oh, you're talking about Stack Overflow?
Among many.
Yeah. Electronics forums. No, I've actually had really good luck with local events for electronics, and kind of making friends with people on a one-to-one basis. I think electronics, it's not as much of a niche hobby as homebrew, so you can actually find other people in your town that do it.
IRC.
What's that?
IRC.
IRC? Real FNet? So yeah, that's been really helpful for me. I actually a month ago or so, took an analog synth building class. And that was a really awesome experience. Like, you're in a room full of people that are interested in electronics, and so that's kind of been actually learning how to make an analog synth will really accelerate your soldering skills. Because I soldered like 1 million connections to rotary switches, and I wanted to die. Yeah. But actually, you bring up an interesting, it made me think of something else, is like, the electronic scene actually has a similar problem I was kind of alluding to with the like tutorials, and like, it would be really cool if there was a tutorial for how to make a fashion game, but like, that doesn't exist. And I think in electronics, a lot of the like getting started and tutorials and stuff are like, how to make a robot that punches people, and like, like for me, like again, I don't want to be like a gender essentialist or anything, but just for me personally, like I don't like violent things or like like drones. It just doesn't interest me. And so it did take a long time to find an avenue into electronics that actually excited me. And that's another reason why I think we need like people with diverse perspectives coming in. I'm probably thinking of other angles, not just gender, right? Like to bring more things that will, not to shut anyone out, not to say like no more men or in electronics, but to expand like the net, right? So you can capture more people's interest. Yeah. Any other questions? Going once. Well, we're exactly at time, so that's perfect. Thank you all again so much.